In today's episode, we're going to learn about the Choose Life project, and to do so, we're going to speak to Steve Duffy, who is the project manager. We're also going to speak to Dr. Cassie Ogden and Dr. Karen Corteen, both of whom undertook research from Liverpool John Moores University on the effectiveness of the programme. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and also check out the links in the description to learn more about the Drug Education Forum, the Choose Life project, and the research. Thanks for watching. Steve, great to have you on, mate. If we can kick off with you, that'd be ace.
Yeah. Okay. So my role on this, I was a prison officer for 21 years, and this all has its roots in HMP Liverpool. When I joined the prison service, I thought I was going to be looking up sophisticated criminals. When I got in there, I realised it was just addicts. That's all I was locking up. I got to Liverpool prison, and we had 1,520 inmates. At least 80% were addicted. It was all heroin then, all heroin. Um, and basically, I become the first drug liaison officer. And what I started to do then was indicative of people's attitudes towards addiction. We never even had one poster up in the whole place. Everyone just seeing it as the inmate's fault. If they wanted to carry on taking drugs, they were going to keep coming back to prison. It was up to them to sort it out. And they seen it as a sort of model issue, which nowadays we know it isn't. It's an illness. Um, we did this play written by the inmates about how they got into drugs and all like that, and they were brilliant. And he went down the workshops and he did the sewed in all the drop downs for the exercise scene and then the prison scene and all like that. It was brilliant. And we used to do that for the inmates. And it just moved on. And we had this one day where I realised that if you were engaging with a drug agency in the community, and you went to prison, it was like going into a black hole. No one could get in touch with you, no one could speak to you, and that wasn't so good. So what I decided to do was invite all the drugs agencies into Liverpool prison to see the play, and then I was going to get up and talk about um, lines of communication, and that was all that was going to happen that day. So all the drug agencies come in from the city, and we did the play, and then I got up to start to talk, and this lad just turned around to me and said, "Can I say something here?" I said, "Why? What do you want to say?" He said, "I want to talk to these people while I'm in prison." So I said, "Sure," because there's about 60 or 70 people sitting there. And he goes, "Yeah." So I was up front with the audience, told them, I said, I was going to talk to you about lines of communication. This kid wants to talk to you about why he's in prison. Could be interesting. Let's see what he's got to say. So he gets up and he starts talking. And he said, "My life is all right till about 10:30 at night. And my alcohol was coming home from the pub. He said, there'd be murder. He said he was a vicious, horrible, violent alcoholic. And he said he used to come in, my mum would put his tea down, he'd pick it up and he'd smack it against the wall. And he said he'd start getting hold of my mum by the back of the head then. And he said, I was 6, but my brothers were like 14 and 15. And he said they'd jump on his back. He said, well, it wouldn't be a push fight. They'd be punching and butting and there'd be blood. And my mum would be screaming her head off. He said, I used to run upstairs, dive on the bed and cry myself to sleep. He said, I saw my mum was taking these tablets. So I said, why are you taking the tablets? She said, the doctor's prescribed to me so I can get to sleep. He said, well, I was having nightmares. So he started to rob his mum's tablets. His introduction to drugs was robbing his mum's tablets, age 6, so he could get to sleep. He said, the obvious thing happened and we got split off in the end. And 1 minute I'm in St. Helens, the next thing I'm in North Wales and they're saying, this is your Uncle Billy and your Auntie Jean. And he's going, nah, nah. Mine's his uncles were all in St. Helens. He said the parents were always okay, but the kids were a nuisance. He'd say to me, you're only here because your mum and dad are evil. He said, well, I hated my dad, but I love my mum. I was only 6, I was missing her like hell. And he said, if I got given a present, he'd say to me, well, it's not yours, and just take it right back off me. He said, and soon realised how to move on. Smash a window, rob a purse, he'll soon move you on. And he said, that's what I did. But I had a reputation then as a dead, troublesome kid who couldn't settle down anywhere. About 14, I ended up in a secure unit in Liverpool. He said, but because I was from St. Helens and they were all scousers, I got bullied to death. He said there was paedophiles in there as well. He said, so we used to go in the dorm of a night. The lights would go off. There'd be loads of nervous laughing. And then After about an hour, you'd hear the door get unlocked and you see them grab the first kid and take him out. So they all started to make sure I was in that bed. He said it was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. He said I got out of there and quickly went into the outside world and picked up a heroin crack cocaine addiction. He said, and the crimes I was committing were a disgrace. He said, I just didn't care. There was so much anger within me, it was unbelievable. He said, I started to turn my life around in Leeds prison. I got put on a victim awareness scheme. He said, I'm in Liverpool prison now on Choose Life. And he said, all I want to be is normal. As I looked round the to chapel, you couldn't hear a pin drop. I put the lads back onto the landings and I'm taking the visitors down to the gate. And they all turned round to me and said, that was unbelievable drugs education. You should be doing that for young people and professionals. And I was like, that, yeah, it was, wasn't it? It's fantastic. I was as shocked as them. Next day, I went on to the landings to get the lads off for a debrief. And as I'm walking down the landing, the lad who told the story turned round to me and said, you know what? I never got to sleep till about 5 o'clock in the morning. Being able to tell people what had happened, why I did what I did, was just unbelievable. And thought we got something very, very special here. And that was the start of Choose Life.
Great stuff. Appreciate you, mate. Thanks for that background. I look forward to hearing more about the project. So, Cassie and Karen, when did you kind of come into this then? If that's Steve's kind of outline of the the sort of initial reaction that not just Steve had, but all the people that seem to be in that room or kind of hear that had. When did you guys kind of come into this story? Start with you, Cassie.
Okay, so hi, I'm Dr. Cassie Ogden. I'm a sociologist at Liverpool John Moores University. And the first I heard about the project was via Karen. So Steve had contacted Karen, so he knows he's got this good, this interesting model for addiction education, but he also recognises that we need some sort of evidence base to demonstrate whether or not it works. So Steve was interested in getting universities involved to do some research to evaluate the project. And so it came, we basically divided the evaluation project into 3 different streams. And Karen will talk to her stream, but basically we had a stream that was evaluating how well the education programme worked with professionals, with children in schools, and then the third one was with the volunteers themselves, how it impacted upon the volunteers themselves. So I'm involved in the project via the schools project. So it was my job to evaluate, go into schools, see what the Choose Life project did, and evaluate the ways in which it was effective and the ways in which it could improve.
Great. And what was your role, Karen?
Okay, so I'm Dr. Karen Corteen and I'm in the School of Law and Justice Studies. So I've known Steve for over 15 years and I first saw the Choose Life project when he was actually in HMP Liverpool. And then when I've been in different universities, I've always invited once we couldn't go back into the prison, the different universities I've worked in, I've always invited the Choose Life project in, and I've always found it really impactful, just from the things that students have said to me. So I oversaw the 3 evaluations, and my main part in it was evaluating the impact on university students. So the research was in 5 universities in England, and because they are going to be the future professionals, and given that they are studying criminology and criminal justice related modules, and that's the careers they're going to go into, then the chances are is they are going to come into contact with people who use substances or maybe even in addiction. So I thought it was really important for them, and that was my evaluation, was the impact on university students. So it was on their personal, academic and professional impact, so how they think they might take this experience and utilise it in their professional post-university life.
Great. And the discussion will evolve into kind of what some of that research showed, what that evaluation looked like. But what I'm really interested in hearing more about, and I imagine people that watch this podcast will be interested in, what does an intervention look like? I know you kind of mentioned 3 different groups there, but let's focus on young people. Let's focus on children in schools. Steve, you kind of talked there about the birth of the project being at sort of the sharp end of the criminal justice system, and an environment that you rightly pointed out. There are lots of people who are very unwell with quite serious issues, which can often be forgotten about and left in that revolving door of the prison system. It's obviously an intervention that was very successful there. How's that adapted to a very different environment in schools? What does that look like for young people?
What do you know is when we go into schools, we start off with we role play a drug dealer. Um, very, very quickly, what had happened is I talk for about 10 or 15 minutes about the prison, of how when I joined the prison service, I didn't expect to be locking up addicts. I thought I was going to be locking up sophisticated criminals. I just couldn't believe it when I got in there and seen what it was like. And obviously, we know over the last 30 years, the prison population has just shot up. Again, all addicts. Things are getting worse. Um, so I'll say you haven't come to listen to me talk. You come to listen to the volunteers. So I said we've got 3 volunteers. We got Tracy, we got Julie, and we've got Andrew. Tracy and Julie are normal volunteers. Andrew's a bit different. I met Andrew in the prison. He was doing a hell of a long sentence for drug dealing. Um, I got to know him, and I said to him, when he gets out, will you come and do a presentation? We're role playing this, by the way. All our volunteers are in recovery. They've been heroin, crack cocaine addicts. Nearly all of them have sold drugs, but they never sold it in the role that we're doing the role play, if you like. We role play the man who's at the top, doesn't touch the drugs, doesn't see the drugs, and all like that. And we start off and I'll say, okay, yeah, I know you're a bit nervous. So what drugs you used to sell? And he said, oh, I used to sell cannabis at first, but it was smelly, it was bulky. The one isn't the money in it. He said, so I started selling all the powders, heroin, crack cocaine, all the rest of it, more money in it. And I'd say, well, you didn't use the drugs, did you? No, I wouldn't use the drugs. No, you don't get high in no supply. I said, you wouldn't physically put your hand on a drug. No, paying someone else to do that. Get other dickheads to do that sort of thing. And I'd say, okay, how did you get other people to sell the drugs? He said, well, I had people below me. And I used to send them into the parks. And you'll see the same thing in any park in the country. Young lads, normally young lads in there, smoking cannabis, not going to school. They all think they're dead smart, and we'll play on that. We'll go in there and we'll tell them how smart we are, how smart they are. Uh, and then we'll show them how much money we've got. Then we'll give them the all-important mobile phone. And we'll send them out there. And they're right up for it, right up for it. And I'll give them a ball with 10 bags in. Each bag's worth a tenner. For every 10 bags they sell, they can keep one, i.e. £10, and I get 90. But they can do that any number of times a day. They can be earning more money than their parents and what have you. I'll say, okay. I'll say, I'm going to challenge you. And he's like, that, you can do what you want. I'd say, I used to work in Hindley and Lancaster Farms, young lads, 15 to 21. I'd see loads of young lads coming in for selling drugs. Would you look after them? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, would you look after them if they went to prison? He said, why would I look after them? I said, well, you're partially responsible to go to prison because you give them the drugs. Nah. They all know the score. And if they get nicked, they know the score. They're on their own. So the only time I'd ever have any dealings with after that is they're inside and I can get to them. And I can get them selling the drugs for me in the prison. Bag of heroin in Bootle is £10. In the prison, it's 50 quid. They were more used to me in the prison than out the prison. Besides that, if I couldn't get near them, I'd go and see the family, the mum, the dad, the nan, the granddad. Someone would pay the money. So if they got caught with £500 worth of drugs and the police confiscated it, that was my money and I wanted it paying. The debt would always get paid. I said, all right. I said, do you want to tell me that story about the dog? And he goes, yeah, and he laughs. And he said, the dog had worms, so I went to the vets. And he said, mate, your dog needs worming tablets. He said, went to the shop to get them. I walked out the shop, put them in the palm of my hand. I thought, don't half look like ecstasy tablets, only red and yellow. So I went online and I bought thousands. And he said, I was getting them for 10 pence each. These are all true stories. And he said, obviously, I wasn't going in the club selling them. I had other people doing that for me. I'd say, put the dog worming tablets in the left-hand pocket, the ecstasy tablets in the right-hand pockets. When you first get in there, give them ecstasy tablets. After a while, and they're all into the scene, just start giving out the dog worming tablets. I was getting the dog worming tablets for 10 pence, and I was selling the ecstasy at the time for 15 quid. And I said, massive profit. He said, it was the best profits ever, best profits ever. I said, all right. I said, how did you know the real ecstasy tablets were real ecstasy tablets? He said, well, I didn't. But we always had a Joey to test them for us. And we'd give them the tablet. He'd test it. If he said it was good, we'd buy the batch. He said if it was crap, he wouldn't buy it. I said, yeah, but when you handed that kid that tablet, you didn't know what was in it. He said, no, I'm dead. He said, I'm not a chemist. But that was the score, and we all knew the score. I said, okay. I said, you used to bash the drugs, didn't you? He said, yeah, we'd jump all over them. I said, well, do you want to explain what bashing is? He said, yeah. I said, I'd bash the amphetamine with oh, what is it? I forget now. Cocaine with benzocaine and the heroin with mannitol. He said, the benzocaine is what the dentist gives you to numb your gums. I said, well, where would you get the benzocaine from? He said, well, people think it's just people on the streets using drugs, isn't that? He said, we got a lot of dentists using our cocaine and they get into debt. And as soon as they get into debt, we're all over them then. And we want the benzocaine and they're giving it to us. So I said, so the dentist is giving you the benzocaine and you know what you're doing? I said, oh, yeah, yeah. He said, but they're knackered, aren't they? They're knackered because of their addiction. And he said, the best stuff's the mannitol with the heroin. He said, we got a kilo of heroin, kilo of mannitol, bash it together, and it'll double or treble my money. I say, yeah, I'm going to challenge it again. He said, again, see what you want. I said, the heroin you're selling with the mannitol in, people would have injected that. And he's like, that, you can do what they want with it once I've sold it to them. I'm with the money. And I said, okay, what happens to the addict when he injects the heroin with the mannitol in? It goes through the bloodstream, round the heart, round the liver. What happens to them? And he goes, Mr. Duffy, if you wanted someone with a conscience, you should have brought a vicar. I'm a drug dealer. I was just doing it for the money. At that point, one of the Gale volunteers will then go, hang on, Steve, what have you brought him in for? He's glorifying this. I thought we were going to do addiction education. And he just turns around and goes, listen, look, I had women like you on the phone to me 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, screaming away for it. So don't start complaining now. It was your choice to take it. It was my choice to sell it. And I'm like that. Okay, calm down, calm down. Then I tend to turn around to him and say, okay, there's two sides to this, isn't there? One, you did make a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. You made a lot of money. I said, but when I met you, you're doing a hell of a long sentence for drug dealing. Do you want to tell him what sentence you got? And he goes, yeah, I got a 5 and a 10. And I said, tell him what the judge said to you at the end. He said, the judge says, I'm on 3 strikes. I've had 2 strikes. And I got the 3rd strike. I'm lifed off. I said, so you don't do it now, do you? No. I said, if you never had that life sentence hanging over you, would you still be doing it? He said, yeah, dead right, dead right. The money's unbelievable. Um, So then he stays in row and we ask the young people for questions and they start asking them all questions. And then one of them maybe always say, have you got any kids? And he'll go, yeah. And what if someone sold the kids drugs? They wouldn't. It wouldn't happen around where I live. Everyone knows me. And then we go on to the life stories and what have you.
Yeah. So it's this kind of like, so you're sort of presenting the issue through role play and dialogue, and then there's a bit of back and forth. How many kids at a time? Like how many people would be in the room in that intervention? Roughly.
Well, when we do different things, but when we do that, we do the whole year group. So we've had like 300 kids there.
So Cassie, from from your perspective, then when the project is doing those sort of interventions, how were you evaluating the effectiveness of that as an intervention? What did that look like?
Yeah, well, firstly, I would just want to add to C. So I think the key features, like the things that differentiate Choose Life Project perhaps from other drug education, which may be having authority figures coming in, like the police, to talk through that. They are this kind of role play is one of the key features, and also the individual volunteers' testimonies. So their life stories that they get this opportunity then once the role play is exposed for this kind of this isn't really the top drug dealer, this is the hierarchy. The volunteers do have a chance to tell their stories, like unstructured, just tell their stories from their perspective. And also there's a Q&A section whereby the students or the pupils are able to put their hands up and ask whatever they like. They're not restricted. Alongside this, Steve also talks about the role of addiction from kind of like a biological and psychological perspective. So there's this kind of multidisciplinary understanding of addiction that the pupils in the room are getting. It's not just the stories. It's not just an understanding of what happens in the body when addiction starts to take place. It's a social political. So when they're telling those stories, Steve is like signposting, or like, did you notice that when so didn't get any help, then they they went back to the drugs. Or so it's kind of like highlighting a multifactorial understanding of addiction. So so that struck me. So what we did for the school evaluations, I was able to come along to 3 selected schools with Steve and the team to see how it was done, so to actually experience it. We selected those schools carefully, so we tried to have a good representation of rural schooling, of urban, and of like a semi-rural setting. And Steve also will respond to some schools where they will say, actually, can you come into the year 8s? Because there's a real problem there. So, there's all these sorts of things going on as to where and why Steve is at these schools. So we selected those carefully, and we designed alongside Karen, we designed a qualitative questionnaire for students to complete once they'd gone through the Choose Life project. In the end, the evaluation contained 192 completed questionnaires from the pupils. So it basically involved quite open questions where they were able to respond to it. And what it was doing was testing or evaluating what they thought about addiction and people who are impacted by addiction, those people who use substances, before the event. So they were asked to reflect, what did you think of addiction? What did you think of people who use drugs or alcohol or any substances beforehand? Then they were asked to reflect on what they thought afterwards. Alongside this, they were asked questions with regards to who they thought had the responsibility for this as a social problem, and there were open questions to see if they did even think of this as a social problem at all, or was it an individual problem, etc. So we 192 qualitative questionnaires, quite a good number to have on a study of this type. And they tended to be young people between the ages of 12 to 14. This is generally because Steve goes into year 9. It tends to be related and as part of what we call the PSE education curricula. And so schools will have certain dedicated time where they explore different socio-economic, physical, personal kind of educational topics. So we'd be going in on that basis. So it tended to be year 9, but I think one of the ones I visited, Steve was actually requested to specifically go to year 8. There was a particular issue in the community in relation to these children. And that's how it started. So then once we get those questionnaires back, we go through, so I've gone through that as in a thematic analysis, so looking to see what sorts of themes are arising. And then from that, we can deliver the conclusions.
And what were those conclusions then, Cassie? And Karen, I'll come to you in a second to find out sort of similar process that you followed with the other cohort. But what did you kind of find from those responses?
Yeah, so I'll try and be as succinct as possible. But the basic premise was before they, when they reflected on what they thought of addiction before the Choose Life project event, their understanding of addiction and the people who use substances were quite oversimplified, and often they relied on inaccurate portrayals or stereotypes regarding addiction. So we said there were around 4 main themes in the way that they thought of addiction, and these were that they felt people who use substances or were addicted had some form of tainted characteristics. So the kinds of language they used to describe people that were there telling their stories were almost always negative, and you can imagine how those kinds of adjectives played out. So they thought they were in some way suspicious, maybe stupid, maybe unthinking, and it was usually or dangerous or something. So this led into the other theme, which was around addiction itself being something to fear, and the people who were addicted as some people to fear. So this again was all around the idea of there was some sort of tainted characteristic behind that. And also they felt addiction was an individualistic problem. there was someone to blame for addiction, and it was the person who took the drugs, who took the alcohol, etc. But sometimes, what was interesting, that there was some theme. It wasn't the most prominent, but there was a theme where people recognised that people who got into addictive lifestyles were in some way a product of their circumstance. So now you're thinking, oh, well, that's interesting, because you'd think that would be an after effect. It wasn't altogether positive idea. So almost like they stereotyped the circumstance itself. So it was like, oh, they're these people who live in these conditions, and it's other from me, and that's why they get into addiction. So that was kind of like the four main themes that we found. Following the Choose Life project, we did see quite a marked difference in terms of how the pupils themselves felt towards it. There was, generally speaking, a wider social awareness from the pupils. So when they were asked to describe what they knew about addiction or what they felt about people who use substances, they were better able to cite certain social factors to bring in the complex interplay and environmental circumstances that often lead to it, which weren't there before. They reflected on how they felt beforehand. They even were quite aware of media representations of addiction, which they felt were quite sensationalist, were stigmatizing, and often adopted and reinforced and reproduced the individual accounts of substance use. So that was quite interesting. And I think that comes from that interdisciplinary approach that Steve and the Choose Life project gives off. There was an understanding, and that relates to that first theme, of the reality of addiction. So this was not just about the social situation, it was about an understanding of addiction. So prior to that, people's views generally were that addiction was something that you get into because you're in some way misled or stupid, and you're just after the kick. So that addiction, that's always going to happen. So after Steve's CLP event, they would understand that in a different context. Even that's more complex. Addiction's more complex. And so there was an improved understanding of it as a chemical process. And it wasn't just a substance user's goal or purpose. It was something then that becomes beyond their control. And then finally, and really importantly, we felt that there was a real enhancement of empathetic reasoning on part of the pupil. So responses within the qualitative questionnaires really demonstrated how pupils had a real emotional connection and response to the volunteer's story. So the volunteers' stories in particular tended to generate empathy and allow for connections between people who might have very different lifestyles but could connect on a human level. This level of humanistic understandings of addiction was almost totally exempt from their feelings before the CLP event. So empathy allowed for this greater capacity for a pupil to fully understand a situation. And even so, when we looked at what that then manifests into, we also asked them about what should be done then. Like, do you have any ideas of what should be done? And we did have a few pupils from the 192 that would still say we need to punish them. So there was this theme of like, there's this punitive support element of it. But they were very much of the minority. We had to report that was there. So it is there. So there's some part, and it might be because they're showing off in front of friends. There could be all sorts of different factors. But there was this element where we're like, we still need to punish these people. But the vast majority of solutions that were reported from the pupils were that of either therapeutic support. So there was a recognition that at any point in these people's addiction careers or their experiences, if someone was there to help them, even if it was a family member or definitely if it was a professional support, a therapeutic professional support, it could have helped, could have prevented further relapse or commitment to the substance. and then importantly, wider structural and societal support. So actually, I'm a sociologist. I'm used to students writing about, like governmental support, this, that, and the other. But honestly, like without giving them a sociological lecture, these peoples were writing stuff like, what government need to do more, or what can we do as a nation, what the community can do more, and that, in a nutshell, is what we found out.
It's really interesting, super fascinating piece to go in. I guess it's research that's not often done on that cohort around that issue, right? I imagine that's quite a rare thing for a piece of research to try and understand where were these young people at prior to this intervention and where they're at now. It's really interesting things. I want to kind of come back on some of those things in a sec. Karen, so if I've got this right, you kind of looked at a slightly different cohort to Cassie then. You were kind of looking at the university volunteer.
Yeah, so we were looking at university students. So all of the students were on either criminology or a criminal justice related program. So it could be in a policing program. And obviously they're then going to go into careers related to the criminal justice system, and drugs and crime go hand in hand. Like Steve said, most people in prison have addiction, either alcohol or drugs or both. So I just thought it's important for them, and again, the same as with Cassie, self-completed questionnaire. So mine was much smaller at 31 self-completed questionnaires, but I found very similar things to Cassie, really, that they started off in what they thought before was quite punitive, individualistic, responsibilising these individuals. So we actually produced word bubbles for before and after. So I've got mine here. So before, the key words that was coming out was it's a choice, peer pressure, disgusting, dangerous, they're to blame, poverty, destructive, unsafe, again, dangerous, harmful. So very, very negative connotations. And then in the after, the words that we put into the word bubble, we've got things like it's an illness, harm reduction, small victories, scary, sad, life ruining, vulnerability, it's not a choice. So very different attitude. So again, much more empathetic response, and also a move from a punitive response to a welfarist. So they were saying things like, and given the criminal justice students, they were saying things like they don't need a criminal justice system response, they need a social policy response. This is a health policy and a social policy issue, not a criminal justice policy issue. But also this was a different audience. So things that we had that was different that I found was some of the students said they'd never thought of working with people in addiction before, and now that's what they want to do. We had a few potential police officers who were on police training who said, I'm going to go into this as a police officer with a completely different attitude. I would have before thought, get them, put them away, throw away the key. Whereas they were saying, I now realise what these individuals need is help and support. So it made them think, for students who'd already thought that they were going to go into that as a career, they still found it just reinforced that that's what they wanted to do, and it reinforced the way that they wanted to do that, which I just thought, I mean, one of the limitations with my study is small, it's 31. I mean, that's still a lot for a qualitative study, but that is one of the criticisms. And also it's not a longitudinal study, so that was the impact of the Choose Life event there and then. How long that impact will last and how long that will stay with them in their university and post-university life, we just don't know that, and we do acknowledge that is a limitation of the study. But I think the initial impact is powerful, both for pupils and for university students. And I think both Cassie and I found it was the role play and the lived experiences that really hit home. And there's actually, I've just been reading a journal article about using lived experience in the criminal justice classroom in universities, and that article actually says it's never been evaluated before. I mean, it only came out in 2024 and we did our evaluation in 2023, and they're obviously not aware of it. But we are going on from this in terms of going forward. I'm going to try and write a journal article on the impact of lived experience in the criminal justice classroom, because I do think it was even more powerful than I expected.
You touched on something really, I think it's really important there around well, two things that you've all touched on actually, which is like the power and the importance of combating stigma and educating people on the reality of a situation that is so heavily misreported in the media and just by wider society, right? But there's something, Karen. I studied criminology at university, and I didn't find the drug treatment sector to like 6 months after I graduated, and then I ended up working in it for absolutely ages, for like nearly 12 years. So yeah, I think going into university environments and kind of saying, hey, look, there's this whole sector. It's not just kind of this enforcement police side. There's this whole other sector that exists. Is really good, not just for students, just for wider society. Because I think so few people just know that drug treatment's even a thing. They just think there's like maybe you see a doctor, or maybe you have to go to rehab. I don't think people realise it.
Yeah, I think it definitely destigmatized the users and the whole area, and it also, and Cassie's written about this as well. It rehumanized people who use substances. It rehumanized them, which I think is really, really seeing them as an individual, as a person, and also seeing the bigger structural issues. The other thing that I would say that did happen in the universities is a couple of people who have had addiction in their lives would come up at the end. So we would it was a bit of an ethnography. We'd watch the event and we'd listen to the conversations at the end. And I remember one young woman came and her dad died of alcoholism. And she said she'd come and talk to the volunteers to thank them, and said that she'd always blamed the dad, and now she doesn't blame him, and she felt more at peace with him, and that she'd always thought, why wasn't I enough for you to stay alive? And she said she could now let that go, and she didn't blame her dad anymore, and she'd now understood the addiction more. I just think that is amazing. Another couple of students also wrote on the self-completed questionnaire that it's alerted them to a couple of their friends that they're quite worried about. Their substance use seems to be getting worse, so they were going to talk to them and help them to get help. So I think at university, particularly at university, when everyone's drinking and going out, it is important for them to know that there is help available, and for them to be aware of some of the potential issues. And I think it's good to see people who have recovered, and I think that's also what's quite unique about the volunteers. It is about the trials and tribulations of recovery. And for me as a criminologist, and you will know this as well, Paul, we do a lot about desistance theory, how people desist from harmful behaviours, including drugs, and they get that, and they make those links and say, oh, it really does show how it is a zigzag. It's not a clear, straight, linear process. There are going to be slip-ups. There are going to be when people go back into addiction, it takes time, and you have to be patient and expect that to happen, and try not to be judgmental.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And this isn't a criticism of the model. It's me, I guess, just sort of putting it in a certain spectrum of drugs education. It sounds like this is really well positioned for a wide range of things that you've talked about. In particular, combating stigma, helping students, young people, adults better understand the reality and the nature of problematic drug use of an addiction, and potentially better support those around them and maybe even themselves. Is that where you would kind of put the intervention, less so in the space of educating kids on MDMA dosage, on the harms of alcohol, so it's more focused on really zeroing in on some of those challenges, rather than we need to speak to kids about cocaine purity, or just what even cocaine is, or what MDMA is. Is that fair to say?
I can understand. I always say this is addiction education. We don't even talk about obviously the drugs come up all the time through life stories and all like that, but we just concentrate on addiction, because I just don't think people understand addiction at all.
Mm-hmm.
So a good example of it, people just think, like loads of times when I'm discussing it with the young people, they say, and I tell them the reasons why people are becoming addicted because of trauma and all like this, and neurodiversity and all like this. And they just say, I just thought you liked the drugs. And they'd see them as morally corrupt and weak and all like this. And a lot of these people, like police, a good example of this is we do Merseyside Police. And normally goes great. Great police are great, especially the young ones, and they want to move forward, they want to help people, and they're all like, that's dead good. But there is that old school there. Oh, they got to break down. And this sergeant come up to me. We're doing Merseyside Police. We've done about 60 police officers, and he comes up to me and he goes, "Seeing what you did there, mate. Very good, very good." He was patronising me, and I was said, "Yeah." He said, "But listen, mate. Everyone's got a choice. Everyone's got a choice." And I thought, how pathetic are you? You've done 25 years out there and you've learned nothing. And it's a story I give him back. I said, I went into a cell and this lad was there and he had by himself and he had this on his bed, he had the newspaper spread out. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm reading the newspaper. I said, well, why have you got it like that? He said, well, I lean across. I look at the picture and I try and work out what's happening. I said, can't you read? He said, no, not at all. I said, you mad? We've got basic literacy there. No, let the time save you. Don't you save the time. He said, I'm not going down there and A for apple, B for banana. And I said, so how come you can't read? He said, well, growing up, he said, I don't know who my dad is. He said, I've never even had a name for my dad. He said, I don't think my mum knows who my dad is. He said, she always had loads of fellas in her life. They meant nothing to me, and I certainly meant nothing to them. She was an alcoholic. There was 6 of us, and she just never sent us to school. And he said to me, if you were in that house, would you have gone to school? Well, the thing's obvious. You're going to do what the significant people around you are doing. That's why he became an addict, because he spent his life feral on the streets, knocking around with other kids who should have been in school who were feral. Then he'd get to about 13, well, about 10, 10 to 13, and he'll start knocking around with the old kids and he's going to get exploited. And next thing he'll be running drugs, and next thing he'll end up in the criminal justice. That's why he became an addict. Not because he had a spliff, not because he had
Mm.
a pints of beer. You know, this he had a choice. It was just a ridiculous thing to say. Just on another little one, like the girls talk so well about the academia of this, but I sort of home in on the things that I see happening in front of my eyes. And we were in Cardinal Newman's College in Preston, and we were doing the drug deal a bit. And we got to the bit where role playing questions and answers, and this girl puts her hand up, and she's a good looking girl. And I thought, well, she put her hand up, and she said, "Listen, you're having to go with drug dealers. They don't do anything heinous, do they? They're just selling what they've got. They do what we're all doing." And I said, well, I'd argue that. And then we carried on. At the end of it, when we'd done the life stories and everything, she made a point of coming out up to me and she said, listen, just want to say to you why I asked that question. She said, as a kid, my mum's a heroin addict. She said, as a kid, I spent my life going to the front door to give the drug dealer money to get the heroin in. I never once blamed him. I blamed my mum for using the heroin. She had to stop taking it. She said, don't know after listen to the volunteers telling their life and the problems they had with their drug use and starting to understand what it's all about. And that's what we're after. People understand addiction. Because I don't think people do, the vast majority. And people who should, prison officers, police
Mm.
officers, they don't understand it. They still got an
Yeah.
attitude about it.
Yeah, and on a reflection of the school's evaluation, I think what Karen brought up, like the limitations of the research, and to do good research, you've got to really say what your limitations are, and the limitations are that we cannot say whether this works to, for example, reduce addiction in those people who saw the CLP. We cannot say that because we haven't asked those questions. We haven't even asked if they're taking drugs or alcohol at that time. We don't know, as Karen said, the longitudinal effects of that. This is what's happened just after. This is what you think about them there. What happens when you go back and go to social media or speak to your mum and dad and, you know, whatever the influences they have. What happens then? No, we can't say that. But what we can do with this research is say it did work this time. We saw the destigmatization happening in real time. So what we can say is that is possible by this intervention, that we can get young people really thinking critically about what addiction is and the ways in which it could become less of a social problem. And that is really important, because so in a paper that I've just submitted, what I say is like, this is key to, as one component in something that needs to be a wider curricula where people are doing the other bit. So Paul, you talked about like, talking about like what the drug taking itself, like what is it, and like that could happen in another session. We should also have another session that looks at poverty, that looks at relationships between families and their kids. Like, it's really important. What we know is it's really important, but it can't work by itself. What we do need is a commitment to a wider curricula that involves CLP and events like this, because we can see it works in that moment. And so it's important from that perspective.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. One is the thing that the Choose Life Project doesn't do, it's not scaremongering. And it's not saying don't do it, because we do actually say, look, lots of people can drink. I drink. I enjoy a drink. Lots of people can take drugs. I am fortunate in that I can have a drink and it doesn't get a grip of me, and I'm not addicted. I can have a drink and leave it. But for some people, for physiological or whatever reasons, they can't just have a drink and leave it. They can't do that. So we do say that. We're not trying to frighten young people or frighten students. We're just trying to show that this journey is a difficult one, and it's a journey that's up and down. But the positive thing about Choose Life as well is these are people who are actually in recovery. So it shows it can be done. And really importantly, the Choose Life project itself is a massive part of that recovery. And there is an evaluation that was done by Michelle Jolly and Sarah Nixon on the impact on the volunteers. And so many volunteers said that they wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for the Choose Life project. Because the thing is as well is, you have to be careful you don't keep people in that narrative, but they don't. They actually, move on and do other things. But Choose Life project has been part of their recovery. It gives them something to get up in the morning for. They feel they're giving something back. They want to give something back. And I think when people say it's a choice, when students see that women have lost their children, they've had their children taken off them, who would choose to have the children taken off them? Who would choose to lose your home? They soon see that this absolutely isn't a choice, and people cannot be punished out of addiction. People have to be supported out of addiction. And I do think that message, however long it lasts, we don't know. That message, at least in the first instance, is really important. And for me, because a key part of my job is teaching people to think critically. And that's what this does. And you've heard it from people themselves who've got lived experience. So it's not me standing there saying, oh, you know what, it's awful being an addict. It's people who've experienced it. So, and that's one of the things that comes through. I mean, I've got a quote here from one of the participants. I thought it was great to hear from those who are recovering, as it allows us to actually hear it from someone who's been through it and not just someone from the sidelines. It was quite eye-opening and difficult to hear the volunteers talk about how they were self-aware and are self-aware of how their actions have affected their family and close friends. So that's one of the participants.
Only just dead quick to say that our volunteers get trained. Whenever we pick up volunteers, we start off the training. They always say, "It's okay, I can do this. I've done a share at an NA meeting," and I say, "No, it's totally different from a share at an NA meeting. The class, the audience is totally different. You're not doing it to other addicts. You're doing it to young people and professionals." And then we start going through, well, what do we want? What do we want that child to know before what we want the child to know after we've had a talk that you didn't know before. And what we're talking about is things like, especially with kids, is danger points. Today we were doing it today, and one of the girls turned around and said, I was right into my belly. I was right into it. But then next thing started drinking and started taking cannabis. And next thing the cannabis, the belly just started to get sidelined. Well, that's a key warning sign, isn't it? The other things he always turn around and says, and next thing, I didn't want to knock around with my mates who didn't want to smoke cannabis or drink. I wanted to knock around with the ones that did. You know what I mean? And the way your life starts, you start making the choices around your drug use. Again, another key factor. And the main one, when things are going wrong, what you do, you speak to someone. They got quality people in schools now. They go and speak to someone. So it's not just about giving the story. It's about hanging the theory on it with it, you know what I mean? And the other thing I'd like to say is if other people want to come in and get involved and can make good suggestions, great, let's make it better. But the kids want to hear the stories. That's what they hook in on. A lot of teachers will say, and they're right, we can have 300 kids in a year. Once the volunteers start talking, you couldn't hear a pin drop. They just hook in right in, right? And they're interested in the stories, and that's good. And we're all the same. When we get educated, we want to be interested.
Yeah, Paul, just to say as well that all three of the evaluations are available. People can find them on the internet. So this is my evaluation here. So if they want to read the evaluations, there's a short one and there's a long one. So there's even a really short evaluations for people who don't want to spend ages on it, but they're available.
From a research perspective, is there anything else planned for this project? Any other kind of follow-ups or revisits to it?
So from my perspective, and Karen can talk to her own, for me and as a sociologist, I think there's lots of lessons here in relation to the possibility of making communities safer spaces and nicer spaces. So we're looking to publish, I have submitted something around destigmatization, the importance of that within the Choose Life project in particular, but how it has ramifications outside of that. And how, it's really crucial to get schools involved in developing kids with critical minds. There's so much misinformation out there. There's so much on social media that's just false. So to have a curricula that really gives people the chance to think critically about something would create a better society. Creating a better society then means that we understand the plight of this person, of the people who are struggling, and in this case the people who are addicted to substances. So that's in particular for me.
See what the future holds. And Steve, what about you for the project? I liked what you said a second ago. You were like, if anyone wants to come and work with us, come work with us. Like, you're very open book with it. What's kind of next for the project?
What we're trying to do at the moment is go into prisons. We're going into about 3 or 4 prisons now. But what I wrote to the prisons minister, and I said to him that those things like, as a prison officer, I never saw anyone get off the drugs. Thousands were getting off the drugs, but I didn't see him because it's just on a revolving door. And I said, an addict probably spends more time with a prison officer than any other professional because they're there all day with them. And it only has to be ad hoc. How are you doing? How are you doing about your drugs? Yeah, have you got in touch with so and so? Could signpost it. That's informal things on an everyday basis. So what I've said to the prisons minister, and he did get back to me, it was a good letter. I said, I would like to go into about 10, 12 prisons. I want them to evaluate it because that was a good thing about the girls evaluating. We evaluated for 10 years, but no one believes it when you self-evaluate. And I understand that really, but it's costly to get a formal evaluation. I want them to evaluate it. And then I'm going to go back to the prisons minister and said, this should be national. Well, obviously Choose Life in Liverpool can't do that. But I'd like other organisations in Birmingham, in London, in Sheffield. Because what we haven't talked about really here now is that every time Choose Life has an event, we take 2 or 3 volunteers. Karen was talking about it. They get so much out of it. You can imagine if a kid who's never went to school, it wasn't, had a bad time in education, and you take him into a school, and next thing he's talking to a whole year group, and the teachers are coming after and saying, "Well done, that was brilliant," and the kids, they all walk out and say, "Thanks, thanks," shake their hands and all like that. Makes them feel good, makes them feel part of society, which is exactly what we should be doing with all people in recovery.
Thanks for watching today's show. Please check out all the links in the description to learn more about the Drug Education Forum, the Choose Life project, and the research. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again next time.